In the year 1513, Portuguese explorers first landed on the coast of China. They've heard legends about this strange land from the people of India and Malacca, with whom they were already trading. The stories told of an ancient empire, rich and cultured beyond measure, and yet secluded and isolated from the rest of the world. Chinese ships, so it was told, once sailed across the oceans, until the emperor decided to close the borders and avoid any contact with foreigners. When the expedition led by Jorge Alvarez arrived at the mouth of the Pearl River, the locals gazed at them with curiosity and amazement. They had never seen white men before. The Portuguese were allowed to visit the port city of Canton, but not to travel any further inland. They admired the goods which this land had to offer: silk, porcelain, and tea, which would surely fetch a handsome price back in Lisbon. But the only thing which the Chinese merchants wanted in return was silver. This was the beginning of one of the most fascinating episodes in history, in which China rose to prominence in the eyes of all Europeans, only to be tricked and robbed of its wealth in the most heinous way. As a matter of fact, Chinese people refer to this period as a century of humiliation, and to this day it is a source of suspicion and resentment towards the West. As you will see, silver played a key role in the events which unfolded. Mysteriously enough, it is again at the heart of global events, and may also play a role in China's revenge. Our story begins during the Age of Discovery, when Spanish and Portuguese galleons sailed across the Atlantic Ocean, carrying with them soldiers and adventurers who conquered and colonized the New World. At the time, the supply of precious metals from European mines was dwindling, and there was an acute shortage of coins in circulation. The discovery of a huge deposit of silver near the city of Potosi in present-day Bolivia alleviated this shortage and made the Spanish Empire extremely rich. It is estimated that 60% of all the silver produced at the time came from this single mountain. No wonder then that the Spanish called it Cerro Rico, or the Rich Mountain. Using this silver, Spain started minting a new type of coin called the Spanish dollar. It is also famously known as the piece of 8 because it was worth 8 reals. It had a high degree of purity of 90% or more and contained approximately 25 grams of fine silver. Thanks to its uniform size and weight, it was quickly accepted all across the world and allowed the development of international trade. As a matter of fact, this coin was so ubiquitous that it remained legal tender in the United States until the Coinage Act of 1857. Shortly after the discovery of America, Vasco da Gama discovered the ocean route to India, along the coast of Africa and past the Cape of Good Hope. By traveling in this route, Europeans were able to circumvent the Muslim world, which was hostile towards Christians, and for the first time in centuries trade directly with the Far East. This allowed them to import Indian spices, such as black pepper, which was important for the preservation of food, but also cinnamon, turmeric, nutmeg, and cloves, which were previously unknown in the West. Thanks to their monopoly over the spice trade, the Portuguese became very powerful. But they didn't stop there. In 1511, they conquered Malacca and turned it into their base of operations. And in 1513, they initiated their first contact with China. Under the rule of the Ming Dynasty, China was a secluded country, proud of its ancient culture and fearful of foreign influence. Its policy of hygiene restricted maritime trade and coastal settlement. This hampered its economic growth and technological development. When the Portuguese first tried to establish trade relations with China, they encountered suspicion and contempt. Nevertheless, in 1557, they were allowed to set up a trading post in the Macau Peninsula, in exchange for an annual payment in silver. China had wonderful commodities to offer, such as tea, porcelain, and silk. Europe, on the other hand, had only one thing which the Chinese were interested in: silver. It appears that at the time, China was suffering from a shortage of precious metals. As the country which first invented the use of paper money, China had already experienced by then several instances of currency collapse and hyperinflation. Chinese merchants have learned to distrust the imperial banknotes and instead demanded payment in saisi, or yuan bao, which were ingots of gold or silver. This unofficial money, which was issued by private goldsmiths or silversmiths, was the people's way of protecting themselves against inflation. Therefore, the temptation to trade with the Europeans, who were paying with Spanish silver dollars, was irresistible. In 1644, the Qing dynasty, which hailed from the region of Manchuria, overthrew the Ming dynasty. The foreign policy of isolationism, however, stayed pretty much the same. During the 18th century, the Qing emperors set up the Canton system, according to which Europeans were only allowed to conduct trade at the port city of Canton, which is present-day Guangzhou. They were given a small strip of land along the bank of the Pearl River in order to set up their warehouses, which were called factories. They were only allowed to trade with a select number of Chinese merchants, who were known as the Kohong. They were discouraged from learning to speak Chinese, and were not even allowed to bring their wives with them, in order to prevent them from settling in China permanently. These restrictions caught the ire of Great Britain, which at the time was a rising naval power. Towards the end of the 18th century, the silver boom was over. The mines at Potosi were nearly depleted, and although the Spanish have managed to locate new deposits in Mexico, none of them was as rich and easy to extract in the methods which existed back then. Europe was having difficulty satisfying the Chinese demand for silver, and was desperately looking for other commodities to trade with. In 1792, King George III sent a large delegation to the city of Beijing in order to present the Chinese emperor with gifts and try to interest him in other products which the British had to offer. However, the Qianlong emperor was not impressed. In his letter to the king, he wrote that our celestial empire possesses all things in prolific abundance and lacks no product within its borders. There is therefore no need to import the manufactures of outside barbarians in exchange for our own produce. His condescending answer no doubt contributed to what followed next. During those years, the British East India Company seized control of the province of Bengal, at the east of the Indian subcontinent. It used it in order to produce large amounts of opium, and with the help of smugglers, ship it into China in exchange for silver. Opium, which is produced from the seed pods of the poppy flower, was known since ancient times as an effective pain reliever and sedative, but as a recreational drug, it is highly addictive. During the 19th century, the supply of opium to China increased 20-fold, from 300 tons per year to 6,000 tons. This trade was so lucrative that American merchants wanted a piece of the action as well. The opium which they smuggled from Turkey was of lesser quality, but cheaper. One of them was Warren Delano Jr., the grandfather of no other than President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The sudden prevalence of opium led to an epidemic of drug use and had a devastating effect on the Chinese society. Just like modern drug cartels, Western nations exploited the dependency of the Chinese on opium and bled them dry of their silver. The authorities tried to fight this phenomenon. In 1839, they seized 1,000 tons of opium from British traders and had them destroyed. In response, the British declared war on China. They dispatched a fleet of warships, which over the next 3 years was able to overwhelm the Chinese defenses and capture several port cities. Although greatly outnumbered, the British Navy proved to be technologically superior, and the Qing army was defeated. The First Opium War ended with the signing of the Treaty of Nanking, in which the Chinese agreed to engage in open trade. They also agreed to pay millions of silver dollars in war reparations and surrender the island of Hong Kong to British rule. Naturally, this meant that the flow of opium would continue uninterrupted. To this day, the Chinese consider this treaty to be unequal and humiliating. But China's trouble was only just beginning. In 1850, the Taiping Rebellion broke out, when a Christian convert by the name of Hong Qiuquan led a revolution against the Qing Emperor. Over the next 14 years, this civil war would claim the lives of 20 to 30 million people. In 1856, the Chinese attempted yet again to stop the opium trade, which led to another conflict with Britain and other Western powers. The Second Opium War culminated with the destruction of the old Summer Palace, the looting of its treasures, and the occupation of the Forbidden City in Beijing. In order to end this war, China had to make further trade concessions, and its ability to govern and enforce its own laws was greatly diminished. Following these events, the Qing emperors attempted to modernize the country and adopt Western technology, but their efforts were mostly a failure. The 20th century proved equally tumultuous. The 1911 revolution led to the formation of the Republic of China and brought an end to 2,000 years of imperial rule. But this republic had no peace and was constantly challenged by the emerging Chinese Communist Party. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria and established a puppet government there. China was powerless to resist, and apart from a condemnation in the League of Nations, received no assistance from the West. In 1937, the Japanese army pushed further into China. After capturing Beijing and Shanghai, they proceeded to conquer Nanjing, which was the capital city of the Republic. What followed was a hideous massacre, as Japanese soldiers murdered at least 200,000 people with unimaginable cruelty. The nationalist and the communist forces formed a temporary alliance against their common enemy, and with the aid of the United States were able to repel the Japanese advance. But once the war was over, the struggle between the two continued. Finally, the communists had the upper hand, and the forces of Chiang Kai-shek retreated to Taiwan. In 1997, the United Kingdom returned Hong Kong to the control of China, and in 1999, Portugal handed over Macau. But the existence of an independent Taiwan has always remained a thorn in China's side. As you can see, China is like a wounded dragon. It had suffered an entire century of humiliation and defeat. By now, its body is fully healed, but its pride is still hurt, and I suspect that it is secretly planning its revenge. This revenge doesn't necessarily have to be violent, but it will surely involve asserting its power over all those who wronged it in the past, and demonstrating its dominance on the world stage. For decades, China has been working relentlessly towards this goal, developing its economic and military might, and now it is finally within its reach. The opioid epidemic nowadays in the United States, which is largely fueled by fentanyl, which is produced in China, is eerily reminiscent of the opium trade during the 19th century. It is as though we have gone full circle, and it is now China's turn to profit from poisoning the bodies and minds of Westerners. But that is not the only parallel with the past. Another piece of the puzzle is silver. There is reason to believe that since the 1970s, the United States has been actively suppressing the price of silver. As a result, it has become a vulnerability in its financial system. By importing large amounts of physical silver, just as it did centuries ago, China can expose this manipulation and force the price to rise. This will set in motion a chain of events that will collapse the US dollar and bring an end to America's monetary hegemony. By doing so, China can defeat the West and become the leading superpower without firing a single bullet. For many years, people in the precious metals community have been wondering, why isn't China taking advantage of this vulnerability? Why isn't it forcing true price discovery? My explanation was that China isn't interested in collapsing the fiat monetary system, and that instead it wants to inherit the United States as the issuer of the global reserve currency. By destroying the paper dollar, it would also be relinquishing its ability to print a paper yuan and committing itself to a new gold standard. But recently, things have changed. The Chinese public is buying gold and silver hand over fist. There is a constant spread in favor of the Shanghai Gold Exchange, which is gradually draining the warehouses of the COMEX and the LBMA. Is this happening by chance, or is this a calculated move by the Chinese authorities? Only time will tell, but it appears that the same metal which was looted by the West during the Opium Wars may now lead to its downfall. Thank you for listening to the Silver Hermit podcast. If you like this content, please donate in the link which appears in the description below. Please subscribe to this channel and share it with your friends and family. Hit the bell icon to be notified whenever I release a new video. Remember, I am not a licensed financial advisor. This video is intended for general informational purposes only and should not be regarded as investment advice. Before taking any investment decision, please consult with a professional financial advisor who may assess your personal investment objectives and needs.